Um, we learned today's daf as Hashem is Masechta Babasa daf Nun, and we're going to start from 3 lines of the bottom of Mem Tes Amid Beis. And what we're discussing over here, what we're discussing over here is like this. We know we know that a husband cannot, if a husband, the Mishnah says that if a husband cannot make a chazaka with his wife's nechasim. For example, if his wife owned a property, and now all of a sudden the husband says, "I've been working here for 3 years, it's mine." So they're going to ask him, "Where's the where's the purchase document?" And he's going to say, "Well, I lost it." And don't you say that anybody who's living in a property with no protest from the owner for 3 years, it automatically becomes their property? But that works by strangers. A husband in his wife's property is in his wife's property. So then it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Why? Because the husband always is around his wife's property. He's taking care of his wife's property because he has a right to eat some of the produce of that property. And even if he doesn't, but it's still his property. Okay? So it's still his property to walk around. So therefore, he cannot establish a chazaka. He cannot establish a chazaka because the reason why he's there is because he's supposed to be there. So if he doesn't hold on to the purchase document, then we don't believe. So the Gemara said, but if he did hold on to the purchase document, right? If he did hold on to the purchase document, so then we allow him to keep it. Right? We allow him to keep the thing. If a husband says, "Here's my purchase document," it shows, right, on my purchase document that my wife sold me the property. So then we allow the husband to keep it because here he brought a proof. Now, but the Gemara established before that sometimes a wife will go along and just sign on any document because nachas ruach, I want to make my husband happy. So we say that if we can assume that the woman did that, then we can assume that she sold a property to her husband not willingly. She sold it because she was like basically pushed into it because she wanted to make her husband happy. So therefore, the question is, why would we say that if the husband produced a document that said, "My wife sold me the property," why would we validate such a document? Why don't we say that the woman, his wife, was forced into selling the property to her husband because she wanted to do nachas ruach? I didn't want to make my husband happy, but that's not really what I wanted to do. So then, but the Mishnah seems to imply that nevertheless, that if the husband will pull out a purchase document, we will believe him. And that question is why. So the answer is Ha'itma Allah. We learned regarding this matter, 3 lines from the bottom of Mem Tes Amid Beis, that it depends what property she sold away to her husband. If it's a property that was designated to her ksuba, so then, wait a second, this property is written in her ksuba. Imagine a woman with a ksuba and says that you're going to collect from this particular property that belongs to your husband. And now we find that really that property should belong to her. And she wrote it that she's selling it to her husband. She lets her husband keep the property. So then only in that case we say that is the case that we will say that the woman was forced into signing that over to her husband. But a regular property, not so. Amar Rabba bar Avhuna, leinitzrucha, ela ba'oisen, forget this, leinitzrucha, ela ba'oisen gimel. It's only by 3 fields. Achash shekasav la b'ksubasa. One of the fields that were exactly written in the ksuba, that it will be from where she is going to collect the ksuba, right? So there, it's written in her ksuba. How is it that she would sell that to her husband? It must be she was coerced to sell that into her husband. And then we go to Anun Amar Aleph. V'achas sheyichad la b'ksubasa. Even it was designated in her ksuba. It wasn't written in as a document, but he designated it like verbally, I guess, from where she will accept a ksuba. But nevertheless, all his fields are designated for a ksuba, but she's confident that this is where she's going to collect from her ksuba. The achas, and one of the fields, shechnisa loy shum shalah. That was really, it was her field. In other words, the husband guaranteed that the field. There's two types of assets that we learned to Masechta Ksubas that a woman can bring into the marriage. One type of assets is where she remains the holder of the deed, and the husband has a right to eat the fruits. For example, she brings a apartment building into the marriage, so she holds on to the deed of the apartment building. It's hers, and he can't sell it, and he has a right to eat the peiros. To collect the rent money. That's one matter. Another matter is, look, she'll bring in a property or something into the marriage, a field, let's say. And the husband will say, let's evaluate the field, what it's worth today. And I guarantee you that money when you get the ksuba. In other words, let's say the field goes down in value. It doesn't matter. The deed was transferred basically to the husband. The deed was transferred to the husband, but the husband has a guarantee that he's going to pay her back. He's going to pay her back or make her full or give her back that field. So those types of fields, from those three fields, if the husband went and bought it from the wife, it's and he's showing here, you see, my wife sold it to me. These fields that we automatically invalidate the sale. He's holding on to the sale agreement. It's invalid because she can say, I wanted to make my husband happy. Okay. So the question is, okay, so in which type of property will a husband be allowed to buy from his wife? And we won't invalidate the sale based on saying that the wife was coerced. Lamute mai, what are we going to exclude? Are we going to exclude any other assets? Let's say his car or anything like that. So kolshkein dehavile eva, the havile eva, he'll be angry. The amma law, he'll tell her, anayich nasati begerish v'misa, that you're thinking about death and the divorce and how much you're going to get. So certainly she was made to feel guilty enough to sign that on the document that he could have it and she has no rights to that. So any other object that the husband pulls out a document and says, my wife said that this belongs to me and she'll never collect for her ksuba on it, we will not trust, we will invalidate that document because a woman will, go along and say, I'm going to sign on that just to make my husband happy. But what is a way what the Mishnah is talking about, that the Mishnah seems to say that if a husband does pull out a purchase document that he bought something from his wife, we will validate it. If it's nichse melug means that, let's say a woman brought in the property, the apartment building, and throughout the marriage, the husband was just collecting the rent money. But really, the deed is in her name. And now he pulls out, after a period of time, he's been on the property, he pulls out a deed saying that he bought it off his wife. He gave his wife extra money, and he bought it off his wife. Now here, the whole deed was originally in her name. So we will not say that she was coerced into signing that because the deed was already established in her name. And now the husband pulls out a document saying, hey, it belongs to me. So we will not invalidate, we'll validate such a document. And that's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says if a husband pulls out a document that he bought something off his wife, he is going to be believed. He's going to be believed. And we're not going to say, oh, the wife was coerced into signing that sale agreement, because The original the field itself was not a field that belonged to the husband, and the wife went along and said, "Husband, you can keep it. I'm not going to collect my ksuba from that." It's a regular field. It's a regular field that belonged to her. It came when she was married. It was always her field. So no one pushed her into really selling that to her husband. If she did, then we will not invalidate such a purchase. Says the Gemara, Ha'amar Amema, but didn't Amema said, Ish v'isha shemachru b'nichsei melug, if a husband and a wife, both agree to sell her property, her nichsei melug, like asav like klum, it doesn't. The sale is invalid, even if, let's say, they sold it to somebody else, the husband and the wife. Remember, the deed is in the wife's name. The right to eat the fruits, the rents is in the husband's rights, and if they both signed on a document to sell it to a third party, it's invalid. So the question is, because we're going to say the reason why the sale is invalid is because the woman never wanted to sell. She went along with her husband who said, we're selling it to a third party, and she signed on it. So therefore, we invalidate the sale. So if they sell it to a third party, we invalidate the sale. Certainly, if we find that the woman sold it to her husband, we should invalidate the sale, even if the husband pulls out a document and says he bought it from his wife. So how do we reconcile our Mishnah with our Meimer? Answers the Gemara, no, a Meimer is not talking about if they both sell it. If they both sell it to a third party, it's a valid sale. So what did Rameimer say? That it's an invalid sale. When did we learn the teaching of Ameimer? If he sold it, right? He sold the right to eat the rentals to somebody else, and he died. So now she has a right to take back. Now she inherits her husband. She can take back the rent. She can take back the rights to take the rent of that property because the property is in her name. She only, through marriage, was required to give the husband the rights to that rental or that fruits. Now that he died, even though he sold it to somebody else, she can recollect it, and that's how we invalidate the sale. Inami, or another case, it's the opposite case. The Zavni, she sold her deed to somebody else. Now that should be worse because she sold her deed to somebody else. Umesa, and she died. Well, really, she owned the property. If she sold it to a third party, while she was alive, the husband, or while she was married to her husband, the husband should eat the fruits. But now that she died, this guy that she sold it to should take over the entire property. The answer is no. He can take over the entire property. Even though the original deed was in her name and she sold it while she was married, so what invalidates the sale? Because b'tekanta the Rabbanim, it's an edict of the Rabbanim, and the Rabbi Yosef Bachanina, it's Rabbi Yosef Bachanina's teaching. The Amar Rabbi Yosef Bachanina, the Sanhedrin, when they were in Usha, made a new law. Isha, a woman, a wife, she sold her property that belonged to her, that the husband was taking the fruits of the property, and she sold it while he was alive. Umesa then died. The husband has a right to tell the guy who she sold it to, maybe assuming right away, that the sale is invalid. My wife had no right to sell it to you. And because I'm the first line of inheritance, and therefore if she died first, then I get back the field. The sale would be valid, by the way, if the husband died and she sold it to somebody else, right? While she was married to the husband, and that husband died, so now the husband's not eating the fruits, and she sold the deed to somebody else, then he would get. So basically, the guy took a bet, but he took the wrong side of the bet because she died first. The husband can take it and from the guy that she sold it to. But if they both agree to sell it to a third party, or or she sold it to her husband, like what our Mishnah is talking about. She sold the property to her husband. Zavina, it's a good sale, right? So most properties in that she owns, all the properties that she owns, if she sells it to her husband, the husband should maintain the purchase agreement. He'll never be able to establish a chazaka and lose that purchase document because we don't allow chazakas for a husband to a wife. But the sale is valid as long as he holds on to the purchase document. The Ibaya said, if you want, I can tell you that Ameimer has a new opinion, disagreeing from our Mishnah. And he holds that our Mishnah holds that a woman can never sell the Nichse Maluk to anybody, right? Like the following teaching of Ameimer. The Amek Rabbi Lazar, like Rabbi Meimer aligned himself with the Tana of Rabbi Lazar. And Rabbi Meimer, if you align yourself with another Tana, you could argue on a Mishnah. The Tanya we learned in the Maisa. There's a halacha that if you and you're familiar with this, that if you take a fatal blow, you give a fatal blow to your slave. So if he doesn't die within 24 hours, then you're not chayiv as a retzeach. You're not chayiv misa for killing somebody. It's very interesting. If you give a fatal blow to anybody and 2 weeks later he dies from his injuries, that person's considered a retzeach and it's chayiv misa. But if you do that to your slave, it's only if he dies within the first 24 hours, the Torah says, then you're a retzeach. If not, you get. If the master did it, he gets off the hook. So it's a 24-hour period. So the Mishnah said, the Brisa says, if you sold your slave, the guy that sold the slave agreed that I'm selling the deed to the slave to you, but for 30 days I can use the slave. The first guy can use the slave. So the first guy has kinyum peros, he can use the slave for 30 days, and the second guy actually owns the slave. So who gets the din of Yom Yamayim? So we have a number of opinions. We have the first opinion is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says Harishon Yeshna b'din Yom Yamayim b'nei tachtav. The first one has the din of Yom Yamayim because he gets to use the slave. Vasheni, the second owner, the one that the first guy sold it to, Eini b'din Yom Yamayim b'nei sheina tachtav, because he's not using the slave. So therefore he only owns the slave, but he's not using the slave. So there's no a din of Yom Yamayim. Kisavar, a mayor holds Kinya Paris. If you own the rights, the fruits of the object, Kinyan Guftami, it's as if you own the entire object. Therefore, the first one owns the Kinyan Paris. Therefore, he owns the entire slave, and therefore he has the din of Yom Yamayim. Rabbi Yehuda says, Hasheni Yeshno B'din Yom Yamayim. The second one, the second owner, the one that has the deed of the slave, has the din of Yom Yamayim, Neishu Kaspai, because he owns the slave. The deed is in his name. Harishain, but the first guy, Eina B'din Yom Yamayim, Sheni Kaspai, because it's not his slave, it's not his money. Kisava, Rabbi Yehuda holds, Kinyan Paris, if you just own the fruits of an object, lav Kinyan Guftami. It's not as if you own the entire object. It's not as if you own the object, and therefore only the second guy has the din Yom Yamayim, not the first guy. Rabbi Yossi says, we go to the page, Shneim Yeshna B'din Yom Yamayim. He says both, the first one and the second one. Second man, the first one has Yom Yamayim because he benefits from the fruits of the slave. He can use it, the slave, during the first 30 days. And the second one, if he would he also has the din of Yom Yamayim, that is your money. And he was not sure what the din is. Rabbi Yossi was not sure. Kinyan Paris Kinyan Guftami is owning the fruits of something as if you own the entire thing itself. Ilav kekinyan aguftami is not as if you own the entire thing. Usafik nefashis lahaka, and therefore we go lenient over here. Therefore, each one of them, the first one that can use the slave, or the second one that actually owns the slave, it's each one of them would give a fatal blow, and they pass the 24-hour period. They're both not going to be chayiv misa because we don't know who's the real owner of the slave. So therefore, you don't know who's the owner of the slave, and so you don't know if you should kill these owners, because maybe there is a din of Yom Yamayim, or there is not a din of Yom Yamayim. Therefore, you go easy on them, and we don't kill them. But here's the point, and this is why we brought this in, because this is where Meimer is going to line up. Meimer, Rabbi Lezer, we'll first say what Rabbi Lezer says. Shneim einem b'din Yom Yamayim. They both, the first one and the second one, don't now have a din of Yom Yamayim. Zel lefi sheina tachtav. The first one, it's because it's not he is zel lefi sheina tachtav, because it's not under him. It's the second one. We're going with the second one. I don't know why he reversed it, but the second one is because he's not using the slave. It's by the first guy, although he owns the slave. And this one, the first one doesn't have din yomi yamayim, is because it's not his money, it's not his slave. He could only benefit from the fruits of the labor of the slave, but he doesn't own the slave. So what effectively Rabbi Lezer said, if two people own something, and one owns the fruits of the object, and one owns the deed of the object, they both don't own anything, and they both cannot sell it. They cannot sell it because they're not considered fair partners in something. So again, if a husband and wife own something together, whereas the husband owns the fruits and the wife owns the property itself, they both can't enter into a sale agreement to a third party because they both cannot sell it. If you own something, you own the rights to the fruits and you own the rights to the property itself. If a normal partnership is 50-50, so they both own the rights to the fruits and they both own a right to the property itself. But there's a unique division between a husband and a wife, whereas the wife owns the property itself and the husband has the rights to the fruits. Rabbi Lezer's opinion is, because of that, no one has a right to sell it. And therefore, Rameimer said that, and basically what Rameimer is saying is that the wife cannot sell it to her husband because she has no rights to the fruits of the field, she cannot sell it to the husband.
What happens when one of them dies?
So one of them dies, then the other one inherits. Certainly, if the deed is in the wife's hands, so then the rent money now goes to her. The fruits go to her. But even in the unique case where she dies, well, the deed was in her name. And we would think that if she sold it in his lifetime to somebody else, that somebody else now takes over the property. In the Sanhedrin made a law that no, she should that the husband can take the property back from whoever she sold it to. She shouldn't have sold it. The reason why, and I should mention this, why does a husband eat fruits? If she brings in a property, right? Let's say she comes from a rich lady, her father gave her an apartment building, and that's hers. So why does the husband get the rent money? Because the answer is because in case she was kidnapped and taken hostage, he's required on the ksuba to redeem her, no matter what the cost is. That's part of the ksuba money. And you don't think this is real, it's real in our time, and therefore he has a right to get the rental of it. But that's really the original din. But if he would die, then the rent money goes to her. V'amar Rava. Rava says, "My time of Rav Lazo." So what's the reason of Rav Lazo? Amakra. Pasuk said, "Leyukim ki kaspehu ki kaspam yuchad loy." Whatever, in order for something to be yours, it has to be your money. You have to be able to own the deed itself and be able to benefit from the fruits of the field. One without the other is not valid. A man cannot. We said before. A husband can never establish a chazaka on the possessions belonging to his wife. So if he bought something off his wife, he better hold on to the purchase document. V'amar Rava says the Gemara, V'amar Rav, that the Rav said something different. And this is a question Rav seems to be arguing on the Mishnah. Rav said, Ish shrika limchais, that a man needs to make a protest. The wife of a man, tzricha limchais, must make a protest. A woman whose somebody is making a chazaka in her property, she must protest. Baman, who is she making a protest? If it's somebody who's squatting in her field, and in order to stop the chazaka from taking effect, she must protest. Rav said, a woman's property, she doesn't have to make a protest. And even if she did not make the protest, we will kick the guy off her property. Why? Because she could always say, the reason why I didn't protest, because I'm assuming my husband is to do the protesting for me. And therefore, there's no such a thing of a chazaka of a property belonging to a married woman. Even if the other guy has stayed there for many, many years, if she's a married woman, there's no such a thing he can establish chazaka. Elalav, it must be babal. what Rav meant to say is that a husband could establish a chazaka. And if her husband's hanging around her fields and establishing a chazaka, she must protest. But our Mishnah said that a woman does not need to, a husband can never establish a chazaka on possessions belonging to his wife. Rava said, really, we're talking about the husband that he was actually damaging the property. So by damaging the property, it must be that she must have sold him the property. In that case, if he was doing such a thing like that, then in order to stop his chazaka, she must protest. Says the Gemara of Amar Nachman, Amar Babu, Ein chazaka l'nezaken. If you damage a property and you're not using it the normal way, you can't establish a chazaka. Ema ein din chazaka l'nezaken. Wrong. You don't have to wait 3 years, but right away, it's assumed that if you start damaging up a property, who does that? It must be that if the guy didn't protest, you must have bought it. So if a husband was damaging up, building a swimming pool on his wife's property, and she didn't protest, we're going to believe him that he bought it from her, because why isn't she protesting on something such a object use of the property? If he's smoking up the property, or she established a laboratories on the property, so then really that shows ownership of the property. Again, same idea. Showing ownership of the property. If she didn't protest, then it must have been that he bought it off her. Rav Yosef says, really, it's talking about that the property is in somebody else's hand. It could go in after the husband died. This guy stayed on the property. So now, and then the woman says, "Hey, this is my property." He said, "Well, your husband was dead for 3 years, and you didn't say anything." So we will believe him that if he says that I bought it off you, because Migoy, he could have said the boy he could have said I bought it off you, and he would be believed. Why didn't you protest? So ki amalei name, if he says also you sold it to your husband, and he sold it to me, mehemen, we will believe him. So again, this is talking about certain particular cases where a husband could establish a chazaka on his wife's property, but other than that, or somebody else, but other than that, normally a husband who bought something off his wife must hold on to the purchase agreement forever, because he cannot establish a chazaka. All right, we'll continue with discussion tomorrow.